Welcome to When Gen X Ruled the Multiplex, the films that shaped the MTV generation. Susan Hinton, known professionally as S.E. Hinton, wrote the coming-of-age novel The Outsiders when she was a 16-year-old high school student in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1965. In 1983, Francis Ford Coppola, director of The Godfather and Apocalypse Now, turned The Outsiders into a feature film from a screenplay adapted by Kathleen Rowell. The Outsiders was praised upon release for its sensitive portrayal of the difficult and sometimes violent lives of underprivileged teens. The film was embraced by Gen Xers for introducing us to a whole slew of smoking hot young actors, including, but not limited to, Matt Dillon, Rob Lowe, Emilio Estevez, Patrick Swayze, Ralph Macchio, and Tom Cruise. Over the opening credits, we hear Stevie Wonder's Stay Gold, a song written for the film and inspired by the 1923 Robert Frost poem about youth, Nothing Gold Can Stay, which factors heavily into both the book and the film. We open in Tulsa in the 1960s, where we meet two teens, smart and sensitive Ponyboy Curtis and his best friend Johnny, who is fragile and damaged. Johnny is played by Ralph Macchio, whom we've already seen in The Karate Kid. Ponyboy is played by C. Thomas Howell, who would go on to star in a bunch of 80s films, including Red Dawn, The Hitcher, and, God help us all, Soul Man. Johnny and Ponyboy are a couple of nice boys, but they are greasers, which means they are poor kids who run with a tough crowd. One of their friends is an older boy named Dallas, who is also a greaser and who is very much not a nice boy. Dallas, who has recently been released from prison, is played by Matt Dillon, known for films as diverse as Drugstore Cowboy, There's Something About Mary, and Crash. Ponyboy, Johnny, and Dallas pay a quick visit to Ponyboy's hunky older brother Soda Pop, a high school dropout who works at a gas station with his friend Steve. Soda Pop is played by Rob Lowe, whom we've already seen in St. Elmo's Fire, while Steve is played by Tom Cruise, whom we've already seen in Risky Business, Top Gun, and Legend. After drifting around town for a while, Ponyboy, Johnny, and Dallas sneak into the drive-in movie theater. The nemesis to the greasers are the Socias, short for social or socialites, who are the town's pampered rich kids. The tensions between the Socias and the greasers form the film's dramatic core. At the drive-in, Ponyboy, Johnny, and Dallas end up sitting behind Cherry and Marcia, a pair of Socias who are sitting by themselves at the drive-in because they got into a fight with their boyfriends. Cherry is played by Diane Lane, whom we've already seen in Streets of Fire, while Marcia is played by Michelle Myrink, who we've already seen in Valley Girl and Real Genius. When Dallas harasses Cherry, Johnny, who is usually meek and quiet, orders him to leave her alone. Dallas flounces off in a huff, and Cherry and Marcia invite Ponyboy and Johnny to sit with them. They're joined by an easygoing greaser named Two-Bit, who is played by Emilio Estevez, who we've seen in The Breakfast Club, St. Elmo's Fire, and Repo Man, and whose father, Martin Sheen, starred in Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now. After the film, Ponyboy, Johnny, and Two-Bit walk Cherry and Marcia home. A blue Mustang pulls up, filled with Socias, including Marcia's boyfriend Randy and Cherry's boyfriend Bob, both of whom are drunk and argumentative. Randy is played by Darren Dalton, while Bob is played by pop star Leif Garrett, who was a huge teen idol in the 1970s. The greasers square off against the Socias, and to head off any violence, Cherry and Marcia leave with Bob and Randy. Johnny doesn't want to return to his squalid home and his abusive parents, so he and Ponyboy camp out in a vacant lot. Johnny, who is still traumatized by a recent brutal beating doled out by a Soc who was very likely Cherry's boyfriend Bob, breaks down in tears while telling Ponyboy about his miserable home life. When Ponyboy arrives home, he finds his oldest brother Daryl furious with him for staying out late. Daryl is played by Patrick Swayze, who became a screen idol for his starring performances in Dirty Dancing, Roadhouse, Point Break, and Ghost, and who died of pancreatic cancer in 2009. The three Curtis brothers, Daryl, Soda Pop, and Ponyboy, are living together on their own after the deaths of their parents, and Daryl is frantic with worry that the state will separate them. As a result, he's strict and humorless. He bawls Ponyboy out for being careless, and they get into a physical altercation. Ponyboy runs off in tears to find Johnny. While hanging out in a park in the middle of the night, Ponyboy and Johnny are ambushed by Bob and Randy and a bunch of their Soc friends. While the Socias are doing their best to drown Ponyboy in a fountain, Johnny whips out a switchblade and stabs Bob to death. In search of Dallas, a distraught Johnny and Ponyboy go to a bar owned by a tough older greaser named Buck Merrill. Buck Merrill is played by singer-songwriter and perennial cool guy Tom Waits. Dallas gives Ponyboy and Johnny $50 and a gun and tells them to hitch a freight train to an abandoned church outside town to hide from the cops. So Ponyboy and Johnny head into the countryside and hole up in the church. They disguise themselves with unflattering haircuts and dye jobs, then spend the next several days smoking, playing cards, reading Gone with the Wind, quoting Robert Frost, and most of all, complaining about their terrible new hairstyles. Dallas arrives and makes fun of their hair, then treats them to lunch at Dairy Queen, where they're approached by a little girl who wants to bum 15 cents off of them. The little girl is played by future acclaimed director and Oscar-winning screenwriter Sofia Coppola. This film is crawling with Coppolas. Carmine Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola's father, composed the score, while Giancarlo Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola's son and Sofia's brother, who died in 1986 at age 22, is credited as an associate producer. In the wake of Bob's murder, there's a big rumble set to go down between the Greasers and the Socs. Dallas mentions that Cherry has offered to testify on Johnny's behalf that Bob was drunk and looking for a fight the night he was killed. Upon hearing this, Johnny insists on returning to Tulsa so he can turn himself in to the police. They head back to pick up their stuff and find that the church is on fire, probably from their cigarettes. A school field trip is taking place in the area, and a bunch of small children are trapped in the flames. Ponyboy, Johnny, and Dallas race inside and save the kids, but the burning church collapses on them and breaks Johnny's back. All three boys are taken to a hospital. Ponyboy is the least injured of the three, and we get to see some extraordinary scenes of 14-year-old Ponyboy casually smoking a cigarette in a hospital corridor. Soda Pop and Daryl arrive and have a big emotional reunion with their baby brother. There is a lot of hugging and crying and freaking out about how terrible Ponyboy's hair looks. Back at the Curtis brothers' home, Two-Bit and Steve drop by to make fun of Ponyboy's hair and to point out that Ponyboy, Johnny, and Dallas are being hailed in the newspapers as heroes. While all that is happening, Soda Pop takes a shower in the background of the shot because Rob Lowe is smoking hot and Francis Ford Coppola is not above shoehorning in some fan service. After a breakfast of chocolate cake and beer, Two-Bit and Ponyboy head into town to visit Johnny and Dallas at the hospital. On the way, they're confronted by Bob's friend Randy, who wants a private word with Ponyboy. Randy, who is struggling with the part he played in the attack that led to Bob's death, has new respect for Ponyboy for risking his life to save the kids in the church. In the hospital, Two-Bit and Ponyboy visit Johnny, who is paralyzed and miserable and terrified at the prospect of dying. Dallas, on the other hand, is in pretty good shape. Two-Bit and Ponyboy find him mouthing off to his nurse, who is played by the book's author, S.E. Hinton. Dallas fully plans on showing up for the upcoming Rumble to get even with the Socs for what they indirectly did to Johnny. Daryl, Ponyboy, Soda Pop, Steve, and Two-Bit hang out at the Curtis home and prepare for the Rumble. There's a great little moment where Patrick Swayze, who danced professionally before becoming an actor, does a cool handstand on a fence, and then Tom Cruise totally one-ups him by doing a backflip off of a car. I am mostly immune to the charms of Tom Cruise, and yet I find his ability to do a backflip extremely cool. The Rumble begins. Dallas arrives, fresh from the hospital, and lots of punches are thrown. It's a long, messy fistfight, but eventually the Socs are overwhelmed by the Greasers and run off. The Greasers are a heck of a lot tougher and scrappier than the rich and spoiled Socs, so this result would seem to have been a foregone conclusion. I'm not entirely sure what the rich kids were thinking by agreeing to participate. Dallas and Ponyboy head to the hospital to tell Johnny about the Greaser victory. Johnny tells Ponyboy to stay gold, an allusion to the Robert Frost poem they discussed while hiding out at the church, and then dies. Bereft, a gun-toting and out-of-control Dallas robs a drugstore. He gets shot by the clerk in the process and goes on the run. He gets into a shootout with the cops in the park, and as Ponyboy and the rest of the Greasers look on in horror, he's gunned down and dies. Later, Ponyboy reads a note left to him by Johnny telling him it was all worth it to save the kids in the church. The Outsiders wasn't the first S.E. Hinton novel to be turned into a film. That honor goes to 1982's Tex, which was directed by Tim Hunter and starred future Outsiders Matt Dillon and Emilio Estevez. Immediately after filming The Outsiders, Francis Ford Coppola remained behind in Tulsa with a few members of his Outsiders cast, including Matt Dillon, Diane Lane, and Tom Waits, and shot another film based on an S.E. Hinton book, the artistic and experimental Rumblefish. In 1985, yet another film based on an S.E. Hinton novel was released. That was Then This Is Now, which was directed by Christopher Kane and starred Emilio Estevez from a screenplay Estevez adapted from Hinton's book. S.E. Hinton mania peaked in 1990 when a TV series based on The Outsiders aired for one season on Fox. Written throughout the 60s and 70s, Hinton's books, which are often credited with creating the young adult fiction market, were a goldmine for studios looking for youth-driven content in the 80s. These were simple coming-of-age stories about young misunderstood characters from the wrong side of the tracks who are led into violence and tragedy due to circumstances largely beyond their control. Because Hinton wrote them when she was the same age as her future readers, these are stories and characters that teens find very relatable. Let's not forget, The Outsiders was written when Hinton was 16, which is probably why a large chunk of both the book and the film is devoted to Johnny and Ponyboy complaining about their hair. Bad haircuts can be uniquely traumatizing to 16-year-olds. The Outsiders is a deeply sentimental and deeply melodramatic film, filled with teary-eyed speeches and noble poses against fake sunrises. It also coined a couple of highly melodramatic catchphrases that still resonate with us aging Gen Xers. Stay gold, ponyboy, and do it for Johnny. Julie Brown's 1983 novelty song, The Homecoming Queen's Got a Gun, does a whole extended riff on doing it for Johnny in what is quite clearly an Outsiders reference. To this day, you can tell a Gen Xer to stay gold, and they're gonna know you're making an Outsiders joke. The film has had a great deal of staying power, and a large part of that is the appealing story, and a large part of that is that extraordinary cast. I talked about the genesis of the 80s phenomenon known as the Brat Pack back in my analysis of St. Elmo's Fire. The Outsiders isn't a Brat Pack film, as it predates St. Elmo's Fire by a couple of years, but in its ensemble cast of popular young stars, it certainly contains the seeds of that future phenomenon. For young actors, being one of the Outsiders was like membership in an elite club, and it created some enduring ties. C. Thomas Howell and Patrick Swayze would go on to star together in Grandview USA and Red Dawn. Patrick Swayze and Rob Lowe would star together in Youngblood. Rob Lowe and Emilio Estevez would star together in St. Elmo's Fire. Tom Cruise and Emilio Estevez would star together in Brian De Palma's Mission Impossible. While none of the principal cast members were entirely unknown before The Outsiders, it dramatically raised the profile of everyone across the board, and it gave them all immediate respectability for having worked with a top-tier director like Francis Ford Coppola. Filled with star-making performances, The Outsiders gave Gen Xers a slew of great characters wrapped up in a story designed to tug on our young heartstrings. Next time, Charlie Sheen comes back from the dead to wreak some havoc in the 1986 cult favorite, The Wraith. Have a wonderful weekend, stay safe, and I hope to see you back here for that.